Next, let's talk about CSS positioning techniques using relative, absolute, and fixed positioning. By using the position property and setting the value to relative, we're able to give the positioning properties of top, left, bottom, and right, which will push on the edge of the element in that direction the number of pixels or percents or ems that you tell it to. So in this case, we're taking a box relative to where it was positioned, and we're pushing down on the top of the element 25 pixels. In other words, we're pushing that element from the top edge down 25 pixels from where it used to be, and we're pushing on the left edge of the box 200 pixels to push it over 200 pixels. So whereas this box used to be positioned here, it's now been pushed down and over using relative positioning. We also have absolute positioning, and when I set this element to position absolute, it also gives us the ability to use the properties top, bottom, left, and right. However, the values that are applied for these properties do something quite different, in that in relative positioning, whereas they're moving the element relative to where it was, in absolute positioning, they're referring to its relationship within the relatively positioned parent or within the entire browser window. So in this case, this absolutely positioned element is positioned top 0, right 0, and this would refer to its relationship either within the browser window, meaning in the top right corner of the browser window, or since it's inside of a relatively positioned parent, it refers to the top and the right of that relatively positioned parent. We also have fixed positioning, which is similar to absolute positioning, except that the element will stay in place when the browser window scrolls. Let's take a look at a live code example of these different positioning settings. Now here I have an example using some different characters, and any resemblance to cartoon characters living or dead is purely coincidental. So here we have a section with the ID of sewer, and inside of it there's a div with the ID of turtle. Now let's set the turtle to position : relative. Okay. Now there's initially no difference, but now that we've given it a position of relative, we have the further ability now to give it a property of either top, left, bottom, or right. And these describe the direction that we're going to push on the element to move it over. So for example, if I say top 20 pixels, this is going to push on the top of the element, and it's going to push it down 20 pixels. So top 20 pixels will actually move it downwards 20 pixels. So you can see there that Donatello has been moved down 20 pixels. And in fact, he's actually unstuck from his element. If I set this to top 30 pixels, you're going to see it will even start to move outside of the parent container there, which is the sewer. Now I can also specify left and right. So for example, if I say left, it's going to push on the left edge 50 pixels. So here, relative to where Donatello was before, we've now pushed on the left edge 50 pixels. So pushing on the left edge actually moves it to the right, whereas if I set this to right instead, right will push on the right edge, which will move it to the left. Next, let's look at this section called Daily Planet, and inside we have an ID of Clark. Let's go ahead and set Clark to have the position : of absolute. Now, absolute positioning also gives us the ability to use commands such as top, bottom, left, and right. However, the numbers are quite different for absolute positioning as opposed to relative. For example, if I set Clark's absolute positioning to top 0 and right 0, Clark can fly outside of the Daily Planet and go into the upper right-hand corner of the screen. So what we're seeing is that when we have relative positioning, when we specify these directions, such as top, left, bottom, or right, we're actually talking about pushing the element relative to where it was before. However, when we use absolute positioning, when we're describing top, left, bottom, and right, we're actually talking about in relationship to the entire browser window in this case. So here, top 0 means 0 from the top of the screen, and right 0 means 0 from the right side of the screen. So here I've placed Clark inside of another section, but this time Clark's been placed inside of a section with the ID of Lex Luthor. So I want to show what happens when you place an absolutely positioned element inside of a parent element that has relative positioning. So here, let's go ahead and set Lex Luthor to relative positioning. Okay, so something quite different happens here. So it's kind of like absolute positioning is sort of like a superpower, and if an absolutely positioned element such as Clark is inside just a plain old element that doesn't have any special positioning, then these numbers, top and right, become in relationship to the entire screen. So remember here, when Clark was in the Daily Planet doesn't have any special powers. It doesn't have any special positioning. So Clark was able to fly outside of that element using absolute positioning, and here top 0 and right 0 made him go to the top of the screen and the far right side of the screen. So just to demonstrate, if we sent him to top 0, left 0, that's going to make him go to the left of the screen. And if, for example, we said bottom 0, that's going to make him go to the bottom of the screen. Now, in contrast to the Daily Planet, Lex Luthor's lair here, this section that's containing Clark, also has some superpowers. It's actually positioned relative. So absolutely positioned elements behave differently if they're inside of a parent that doesn't have any special positioning versus a parent that does. So in this case, when Clark is absolutely positioned and he's inside of another container that's relatively positioned, in this case Lex Luthor, he's unable to break free. In this case, top 0, right 0 refers to the top of the relatively positioned parent, and the right 0 refers to the far right in the relatively positioned parent. So Superman can break out of the Daily Planet, but he can't break out of Lex Luthor's lair. And again, that's due to this relative positioning on the parent. Lastly, let's take a look at the Daily Bugle section, which is holding Peter. So let's go ahead and set Peter to be position fixed. And then we're going to set him to be positioned top 0. And we'll go ahead and say right 120 pixels. So this is going to move him to the very top of the screen because it's set to top 0. And because it's set to right 120 pixels, it's going to move him 120 pixels over from the right-hand side of the screen. So fixed positioning is very similar to absolute positioning, except that there is one major difference, and that is whenever we scroll in the browser window, the fixed positioning element will stay fixed in place, whereas the absolutely positioned element will scroll out of the way.